Welcome to the Hofstra University webinar about the graduate program in linguistics, forensic linguistics. I'm Leonard. I'll be talking to you about working as a forensic linguistic expert and opportunities for students in our program to work on ongoing cases as interns. Our faculty include, of course, myself, Dr. Tammy Gales, who's Director of Research at our Forensic Linguistics Institute. She's a specialist in discourse analysis and corpus linguistics, and we pull in big data for a lot of our cases. Roger Shy, who teaches a special one-week intensive course with me in the fall. And he is the foremost forensic linguist. He's the one who pioneered forensic linguistics in the US, and just in the past decade has published 13 books on forensic linguistics. He was my mentor and my research and case partner on hundreds of cases. Also, Jim Fitzgerald, who was formerly an FBI SSA, a supervisory special agent in the behavioral analysis unit at Quantico. And he also was the former program director of forensic linguistic services for the FBI. And he teaches a special one-week intensive course with me in the spring. So I'm involved with 4 different organizations: our graduate program, our capital offense Innocence Project, which I'll talk about, our institute, which is our research and special projects arm, and private consulting that I do also outside. In places like England, once an expert is qualified, he or she is qualified. But here, one must go through a voir dire process for each case. And these are some of the qualifications that they look at on my part for the judge to decide whether or not to let me testify about my analysis of the evidence. When I worked with the behavioral analysis unit folks at Quantico, and we would do training for FBI agents, other BAU agents, foreign agents, agents from Secret Service, and all sorts of different units of the federal government and state governments, we always said, this was our mantra: language can solve and prevent crimes. And every single time we would do a presentation for a new group of investigators, people would come out of the audience and ask us to help. They had not realized how valuable language evidence could be. Forensic linguistics combines 2 terms that are not exactly high on everybody's easily understood vocabulary list. So linguistics is, of course, the scientific analysis of language. And forensic linguistics is the application of this to a legal forensic analysis of any written or spoken language data. I'm going to talk mostly about analyzing threat letters and like that. But we also do a lot of work in civil cases, as I'll explain. Forensic linguists help non-linguists, such as investigators, judges, juries, attorneys, etc., to really understand, to gain maximum intelligence from language evidence. And one of the groups that we work with are threat assessment, and well, this slide really tells the story. Potential areas for collaboration as a forensic linguistic expert with law enforcement, intelligence, counter-terrorism, defense teams, death penalty mitigation, civil lawsuits attorneys, protective services, people who guard officials, celebrities, high net worth individuals, and many, many more. Because always there is intelligence to be gained from language data. Some of the people that I have myself trained, sometimes by myself, sometimes with FBI agent Jim Fitzgerald or with Dr. Tammy Gales, are listed here. Whenever we do the training, people are hungry for it. They say this is a fantastic skill set to have. This is another arrow in their quiver of analyzing evidence and proceeding along with their cases. As I said, we also do civil cases. It isn't all counterterrorism and criminal cases. So just in the past couple of years, I've testified in Paris about a contract dispute between Turkey and Turkmenistan. The contract was in English. Corporate espionage and patent infringement in Silicon Valley. And I was Apple's linguist against Microsoft and Amazon in trademark infringement cases. Also, plagiarism is another thing that we analyze, and I was involved in a case before Justice Sonia Sotomayor became judge. There was an issue that some people tried to raise whether her Princeton University honors thesis had been plagiarized. And they hired me to analyze it. These folks hoped that I would find that it had been plagiarized, but the answer was no. There was no evidence of plagiarism. So I like to say that Dr. Gales and I take full credit for having Justice Sonia Sotomayor on the U.S. Supreme Court. Turning to criminal and counterterrorism intelligence cases, these are some of the ones we've had just recently in the past couple of years. Corporations and other institutions have many situations where they're trying to understand what's happening with communications. For example, illegal information leaks, threats of violence, espionage, internal threats, external threats, extortion, and other kinds of threateners. And forensic linguistics can help them manage the threat, investigate it, interdict it, stop it, and prosecute when they find suspects. I'm going to be talking about profiling and authorship, but these are on the same continuum. We are finding features that let us continually decrease, narrow down the suspect pool. You'll see what I mean. Because of variation in language, these are some of the characteristics that forensic linguistics intelligence analysis gathering can add to the investigative mix. Not only what country, the native language, but all the way down to work group identity, because people who do certain kinds of work habitually use certain kinds of language, and into individuals when there are exemplars from suspects. Actually, although I'm not going to talk about it today, I worked on the John Benet Ramsey ransom note when the man came out of Thailand, John Carr, and claimed that he had been involved with John Benet's death my analysis showed that he had no connection, and eventually DNA agreed with me on that. So I'm going to give you an example of demographic profiling. What can the language of the ransom note reveal about the writer? So I've heard that once from police. I've heard it 100 or more times. What can you tell us about the person or persons who wrote these letters? And this is a very famous example for linguistics. That doesn't mean it's very famous, but it's all over the web, and different movies have talked about it, and different novels, Kathy Reichs, for example. So this is a well-known example, but today, as I write here in the slide, we also focus on an often ignored under-the-surface profiling feature, something that linguists see that non-linguists don't, even though it's right there in front of everyone's eyes. We look at many, many different aspects of language, and these are some of the features. This isn't exhaustive. It's just mostly these are from the cases that I'll be talking about today. The most important thing is on the bottom. Unless you're getting something somebody wrote to his mother from camp many years ago, if it's involved in a crime, you have to be aware that there could be disinformation in there. People try to disguise their writings because they're trying to disguise their identity very often. And what happens is they don't do it systematically. So linguists analyze the different systems of language, and they see that there are inconsistent patterns, as we'll see in this case. So here is my transcription of a ransom note that was scrawled on a piece of brown, crumpled up paper bag. And you can read through it. It typically takes quite a while for us to do a thorough analysis. I'm giving you all of 30 seconds to see what you can see in here. But one of the interesting things about this case is that when the authorities went to Roger Shai, my mentor, who I introduced in one of the first slides, and asked, can you help us identify who this person might be? He almost instantly answered with a couple of very, very distinct features. They were so distinct, they were so informative that the police, I like to think anyway, said, come on, Roger, we know this takes a long time. What are you, Sherlock Holmes all of a sudden? Can you also tell us that a person limped, like Sherlock Holmes would always say, it limps, and he has a hole in his left sleeve. And there were all these clever ways that he figured this very, very detailed information out. But Roger, similarly, figured out very, very good detailed information. One of the things you saw probably was devil strip. Put it in the green trash can on the devil strip at corner 18th and Carlson. Now, what's a devil strip? Now, if you didn't notice this when you were reading it, join the club, because fluent readers, by definition, skip over things that don't immediately make sense. That's why it doesn't take us a month to read a paragraph. We just scan it and skim it. The faster the reader you are, the more skilled you are at ignoring things that don't immediately make sense to you. Sometimes, indeed, I work backwards on notes like this. So I start at the exclamation points at the bottom, and I work backwards to make sure that I don't do my normal reading. So that's when you see devil strip, and you say, what the heck is a devil strip? And you also, of course, see all these Ks where there should be Cs. Now, there could be a lot of reasons for that. One is the person doesn't know how to write English very well. It could be because they were foreign but very educated. It could be because in their language, you typically put a K instead of a C, but then you find Cash and Carlson and Come Alone, all sorts of Cs that aren't Ks. So that's an irregular pattern. But there's a lot more going on in this note. There's always almost an infinity of things that you can say about any instance of human language. But let's go to what Roger Shy told the police. No parking on Devil Strip. Where is this sign? It turns out the sign is in Akron, Ohio. Devil Strip is used in Akron, Ohio, and only Akron, Ohio. Also notice that while cops was misspelled and daughter was misspelled, in the first line, precious is spelled correctly. Roger asked himself, who can't spell cops, can or daughter, but can spell precious? And what he had said to the cops was, do you have on your suspect list a well-educated person from Akron? That was just from looking at this. And they did, and they went, and he confessed. Now, as I said, there's a lot more going on in any instance of natural human language. Whoop. And that's what the other marker is. Take a look now. It's not just that the person can spell precious, but look at the punctuation. It's absolutely perfect. The dollar sign, the comma after 10 and 10,000. The last sentence, anyone with you, comma. No cops, exclamation points. Come alone, exclamation point. I'll with an apostrophe. Perfect punctuation. Certainly not the same level of education and skill in writing as somebody who doesn't even know that cops is spelled with a C. More profiling. In a threat case we had, one of the sentences was, I challenge that you have the right to have her to yourself. I've known her since a very long time myself, perhaps even longer than you have. So what here is of interest? Read it over. I missed this, but my Columbia mentor, Dr. Benji Wald, pointed it out to me. I challenge that you have the right to have her to yourself. I have known her since a very long time myself. This use of since suggests a non-native English speaker. English says things like, I've known her since 1997, but English does not typically say, I've known her since a very long time. And what occurred to us was perhaps it was a translation of French, depuis longtemps. Was there a French speaker in the suspect pool? Yes, one. And his other exemplars, examples of his writing, matched several other language patterns in the threat as well. So that's profiling. Now let's look at narrowing the suspect pool even further to authorship analysis cases. The second from the bottom, who was the CIA agent Chris who sanctioned a Tennessee assassination? That refers to a recent case that is called the Facebook murders by the press, because one of the precipitating factors was that the people who were victims defriended one of the people who were defendants in the murder trial. It was pretty brutal. Very early in the morning, the two adults were shot. The man had his throat cut. Woman was shot in the face and was left holding her live 6-month-old son. Luckily for the son, if you can say anything is lucky for that baby, a workmate, I think, of the father came early in the morning to pick him up and discovered everybody dead, and the baby survived. The defendants were these two women. The one on the right was defriended by the victims on Facebook, but of course, that's hardly the only thing. They had a feud that went on for quite a while and was pretty intense. The woman next to Janell is her mother, Barbara. The guy is the father and husband, and he, by this time, had already been tried and convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder. They caught him fairly soon after the killings. Another defendant was a guy named Jamie Curd, who was the woman's boyfriend, and he pled guilty to helping the dad kill the 2 people. The murderers were motivated, as I say, to commit the murder by, well, the CIA agent named Chris, who actually didn't exist. It was the invention of the women who hated the dead couple for defriending Janell. Our analysis of quite a number of documents showed that there was no Chris. Well, there was a Chris. He was based on somebody Janell knew back in high school in a different state. But there was certainly no Chris, who was a CIA agent who was telling Jamie, you can go kill these women, this couple, don't worry, we have your back. Janell catfished, which is the phrase we use these days. She assumed the identity of Chris when sending messages, and Jamie actually believed that he was being sent messages by a CIA agent. And we know this is true because when he was finally arrested for murder, he kept telling the police, look, I see what you guys are doing, but any minute Chris is going to come in, tell me it was okay, tell you guys it was okay, and you'll let me go. So the prosecution gave us a number of questioned documents that were inculpatory, that is, showing guilt, which were inciting Jamie to kill the couple. And as you'll see here, these are features in a Q document, that is the make-believe Chris, and the highlighted features are ones that we also find in Janell's writing. So you see unnecessary capitalization and beginning sentence, apostrophe S for third person singular, then for then. Now, none of these are particularly rare. Some get much rarer, but it's the combination of features in both the Q and the known documents that really indicate that the superior hypothesis may be common authorship, that the reason they're so similar is not by chance, but because they perhaps came from the same person. Transposed letters, series of adjectives with no comma, etc., etc. Then, as we just saw for Janell, here are Barbara's. I think it's clear by now that one needs to analyze to a very, very virtually microscopic level of detail and understand what kind of patterns happen. So here, from our report, is some of the Janell patterns. This one is apostrophe S for third person singular instead of without the apostrophe, which is, of course, standard. The JK mean Janell, known, FB, Facebook. Qs are the inculpatory, inciting, inveigling documents. And now Barbara, notice uneven quotation marks. When she quotes somebody, she often begins with a single quotation mark and then finishes with a double quotation mark. This is not very common, but we find it both in her writing and in the questioned inculpatory documents. Phrases like "I am praying," PPL for people, W and a slash for with. Again, these are not the most uncommon features in the world, but it's the confluence, it's the series of them that is telling. And the women were indeed found guilty also of first-degree murder. Jamie was given far less of a sentence because it was clear, the prosecution said, that he had been manipulated and he had not actually killed the Paynes. He just facilitated the dad in killing them. So that's work we did for the prosecution. Work we do for defense is part of our new Forensic Linguistics capital case Innocence Project, which is a joint enterprise with our law school. And the people who get first in line are ones who are actually on death row. That's what makes it capital, is death penalty. And we also take other cases in which we think we can add to the cause of justice because language evidence was not analyzed properly in these people's trials. One of the cases that brought us to the project is what I'll go into. But first, the original Innocence Project, not us, but the Innocence Project, was founded in 1992 at Yeshiva University School of Law. And what they use is DNA mostly. Notice the second bullet point. Studies estimate between, just say, roughly 2 and 5% of all prisoners in the U.S. are innocent. For context, if just 1% of all prisoners were innocent, that would mean more than 20,000 innocent people are in prison. They continue. Most of our clients are poor, forgotten, and have used up all legal avenues for relief. And it's very easy to find in the newspapers these days and online people getting released from prison after 10, 15, 20, 30 years for crimes because they've been imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit. The Innocence Project says that when they know that the DNA shows that the person was innocent, what were the reasons that people convicted them? And here they are. I was asked to work on a case once, but there was another excellent confession person working on it already, Saul Casson, and we'll talk about him in a second. Eventually, this man, Marty Tankleff, who had served 17 years of his life in prison for killing his parents, was released because he had not killed his parents, the judge, and had finally understood there had been a botched investigation and false confession, really terrible travesty and miscarriage of justice. Marty eventually became my student in forensic linguistics And then he went on to law school, and now he is a lawyer. And as you can imagine, he's specializing in this kind of false imprisonment. He was on his 17th birthday. No, it was the first day of senior year. He went downstairs in his house to find his parents dead and near death. And then he wound up being accused of it, falsely imprisoned, spent the next 17 years of his life in jail. He was also tricked into a false confession. He was brought to the police station. The lead detective went away, came back and said, "Marty, your father, he came out of his coma. He's alive." But he says, "You did it." Marty didn't know the police suspected him. Marty had just seen his mother dead, his father half dead. Imagine what a state he was in. And when the officer said, "Your father said you did it," why would he not believe that? So the investigator and Marty set about trying to figure out some story that would fit the actual physical facts. What did you hit your mother with? "My barbell." But there was no blood on the barbell. There was no blood on Marty. And there was blood everywhere in the house. But that's okay. This officer didn't mind those little anomalies. He now had a confession. And that was one of the things that put him away for 17 years. Saul Kassan is a psychology professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice now. And he really pioneered the scientific study of false confessions. So there's voluntary, where you want to show that you're a bad guy or you're slightly deranged, and you go to the police station and say, "I killed so-and-so," and you didn't. Coerced compliant is the old days, hopefully only, of beating people. And coerced internal is when eventually you come to believe that you did it. Marty came to believe he did it. Many other kinds of confession situations, if they simply go at a person long enough, you become brainwashed. And also you just want to leave. You just want to leave. And that's why I write often a mix of coerced compliant as well. Roger Scheid, Benji Wald, and I, in our cases, we've discovered quite a number of other invalid confessions. Third party, for example, the suspect claims he had no hand in the confession. And this is the case we're about to see, or one case. Redacted confessions, where the authorities will, sometimes in the best of intentions, because they think the person's guilty, they'll take a word or two here and a sentence here and put them together and say, this person confessed. Sometimes, I guess, they're doing it and they know the person isn't trying to confess, and other times it's a genuine miscommunication. And one of the things we're studying is the genuine miscommunications and how maybe they can be avoided. So now our Forensic Linguistics Innocence Project we were involved in the case of a man named Antoine Cuby, and this is what precipitated our actually making the Innocence Project. So Cuby was in Chicago, 1996, and his friend was robbed and killed. He and another friend were charged with murder and armed robbery. So here you can read the description from the newspaper. When QB contacted me, he had gone first to another person who researches false confessions of the kind that we were just talking about, where people come to believe they did the crime, even though they didn't, and falsely confess. But when he heard what kind of and that's Richard Leo in University of San Francisco, when he heard what kind of a confession QB was involved with, he said, no, that's not my kind. You should go to Roger Shy and Rob Leonard. So here is the confession, typed, and there's QB's signature. But QB says he didn't confess. This is a third-party confession. He says that he was beaten, told to sign to get a telephone call, and the next time he saw the document, it had a confession typed over it. The prosecution, in testimony, claims the document is a record of the verbatim, word for word, voluntary confession of QB. And that's the testimony from the transcript. Memorialized each and every one of these words, yes. QB claims that he never wrote that and he never dictated it. So the authorship of the alleged confession is questioned. So as I said before, we use Q to mean the question document. And we compared, my students and I, the language patterns of the Q to the known exemplars of the writings of Mr. QB from the same time period. The known documents are we refer to as K, so K and Q. Linguistics, like all other sciences, resolves problems by constructing competing hypotheses and then testing which hypothesis better explains the non-random distribution of the data. So the old hypothesis that the sun went around the earth explained a lot because everybody can see the sun going around the earth. But the people who studied this couldn't figure out a way to make that hypothesis jibe with the movement of the planets. A superior hypothesis was that the earth went around the sun, and then the movement of the planets was also explained. So which hypothesis better explains the distribution of the data? So we looked at the Q and the K, and our two hypotheses were the Q documents are better explained as being instances of the language patterns, and we saw language patterns with the Facebook murders, of QB's known writings or other than QB's known writings. QB said that it was the police or someone else in the prosecution who authored that confession, so we considered that as a possible source of the language patterns. And here we analyze these documents, which are letters, the confession, and the testimony of one of the detectives. So we compared the confession and QB and the confession and the officer as a representative of different language patterns. So what happens is we look for linking features that associate the Q documents and another writer. And as I write here, these patterned uses of language features are somewhat analogous to stray fibers or skin cells in other forensic investigations. Now with us, like we saw with the punctuation in the devil strip note, even though they're visible on the printed page, they can be much less apparent to non-linguists than to linguists. And we looked at these 5 features, which I'll go into in some minor detail. And in general, we found that the features in Q don't also appear in QB's writings. And some of them do appear in the speech patterns of the officer and in the General Register of Police Writings. So here's an example. In English, you can say, I know that he is here, or you can say, I know he is here. And people typically adhere to certain patterns, whether they use that or not. The longer sentences they write, the more likely they are to have that. That's another pattern. And just to begin with, in the Q, only 8% don't have that, 1 out of 13. In QB's writings, 86% don't have it. Contractions. I did not know is not contracted. I didn't know is contracted. In the confession, 17% were contracted. But in QB, even though it was written, and normally we have fewer contractions in written documents, 86% were contracted. So another big dissimilarity. Discourse markers are things like well, now, so. They're used throughout QB's known documents, but there is not a single instance of these discourse markers in the confession. And also, these are more likely, as we see on the bottom, we might expect more usage in the confession document than the known documents because the Q is a record of spoken language, and we're much more likely to use these discourse markers when we're speaking than when we're writing. So this difference of 0 in the confession and 18 in the known is even more amazing and noteworthy, I should say. In police speak, what we call a register. Registers are varieties of a language used for a particular purpose or in a particular social setting. So a preacher on Sunday, a television, somebody selling you some gadget. These are all registers. You know the kind of speech that's going to come out of their mouths, okay? So let's look at this. Confession statements are often very formal. So there's a difference between using a more formal variety of one's own dialect and using someone else's dialect. Another means by which we can analyze the confession with the KDocs is by comparing the language of the confession to other legal or official registers that are used by specific groups that we call communities of practice, people who interact regularly. Now, I know I'm throwing a lot at you here, but you'll see I'm trying just to show how carefully we, the students and I, constructed the theories by which we were attempting to explain the difference between the Qs and the Ks. So, to cut to the chase, the officer in his testimony uses the word approximately many times. In the confession document, it's used multiple times. But in QB's letters, he never uses it. Similarly, at an unknown time, it appears in the confession statement. The officer uses it quite a number of times. QB never uses it. Now, just consider at an unknown time. How likely is an 18-year-old guy going to be using at an unknown time in his normal speech? Not very much, but the officer uses it all the time, and that is what we find in the confession. Then there's even a syntactic structure. Typically, when we use the word then, we say, we ate breakfast, then we went home. But in police speak, it's normally, we ate breakfast, we then went home. QB uses then plus subject, then we. The officer uses subject plus then. What do we find in the confession statement? Subject plus then. So in the confession, it says, I then told Jeremy to move his Jeep. We both then went into the building. QB, in his letters, he says, so then he shut up. I'm going to write, then the little guy inside said. That's the normal canonical way that we use then. And the officer, all three then went out. He then walked away. So who is more close to the confession statement, QB or the officer? Clearly the officer. Now, when we do analyses like this is our disclaimer, this is our note. Just like with DNA, contrary to most people's understanding of DNA, our analyses do not necessarily mean that the patterns in the Q and the K were written or not written by the same person. All we're doing is showing these consistent or inconsistent patterns, because there are many people, no doubt, in the world who could have generated it. But how many people were in that room? And the trier of fact, the judge or the jury, has to weigh what we say in the last couple of sentences there, together with the non-linguistic evidence that supports conclusions of means, motive, and opportunity. Who was there? Who had the ability to do it? Who had a motive to do it? So, in conclusion, linguistic analysis of the evidence reveals an absence of a number of matching links between the confession document and QB, and a presence of a number of matching links between the confession and the known speech of the testifying officer. The type and number of these links strongly suggest that hypothesis 2 better accounts for the distribution of the data. The language patterns of the Q documents are better explained as being instances of the language patterns of other than QB's K. This, of course, supports QB's contention he was not the author of the confession that brought him a life sentence. Unfortunately, you might think that, okay, case closed, they'll open the door and he can walk out because it was clear he didn't write that confession. But that's not how the justice system works, I'm afraid. And QB has exhausted most of his appeals, and he may not actually be able to get this into evidence, even though we can demonstrate it with some real clarity. Thanks for coming to the webinar. Any questions or comments, please feel free to email us or call us. Take care. This is Rob Leonard saying thanks again.